we'll be talking more in detail about the tool that's called Discrete Choice Experiment. As Anna mentioned, it's in the typology is one of the more experimental approach. So here I will be explaining what exactly it is, how to implement it, and I will give some inputs from the case study that we are currently leading in France. So a discrete choice experiment, it's a quantitative method. It belongs to the family of stated preferences methods. And it's usually used to highlight how individuals, in our case, it will be farmers, value different policy features when they are making the decision to enroll or not in a certain scheme. And as such, it's a very valuable tool that can be used to support policymakers when they are designing certain interventions, in particular to increase their effectiveness and to optimize the uptake. So with this discrete choice experiment, as I just mentioned, the goal is to better understand farmers' preferences and their behaviors. It can be used for agro-environmental measures, but it can also be used in different policy settings. So it's a structured and data-driven approach that estimates respondents' willingness to pay or to accept for certain policy features. So it helps to identify the trade-offs and the synergies between different policy options to improve effectiveness and uptake. It can also be used to simulate enrollment under various policy scenarios. And as such, it is very valuable to support ex-ante evaluation and during the design of interventions. It can also enhance transparency, coherence, and stakeholder engagement in the policy cycle. So discrete choice experiment usually comes in the format of a questionnaire that puts respondents in a situation where they have to choose the political option that they prefer between several hypothetical policy scenarios. These scenarios are built from key features that are called attributes that are actually the main characteristics of the intervention of interest. And each of this attribute can take several different values that are what we call levels. And so we combine the levels in different ways to build policy alternatives that are then combined into choice sets that will be presented to the respondents, so in our case, again, farmers, to capture their preferences. So as you can see on the right, to illustrate a little bit more what it looks like, I put a theoretical example of what a choice set can look like, sorry. So in the columns, you have the different alternatives. The lines are the attributes, and so the crossing of an alternative and an attribute, you have the level that has been attributed to this alternative. Here, I also added what I call alternative 0. That's actually a status quo alternative that's illustrates the case when farmers find that none of the alternatives that were designed are actually of interest to them, and so that they don't want to get involved in the measure or in the scheme. It's not mandatory to add such an alternative, but it can be recommended because it makes the experiment more realistic, and it helps to analyze the thresholds at which the farmers decide that the policy is acceptable or not for them. If we take a look at the step-by-step process, discrete choice experiment is actually a rather quite long process to implement, especially the designing phase when you select attributes, the level, and build the experimental design, since these steps are really key, and the quality of your results really rely on this building phase. So the first step is to define the objectives, specifically the evaluation or design objective, identify the decision context. The goal here is to clarify the policy question that the DC will aim to answer, and to ensure that the design that will be built later on will reflect a real-world decision setting of the respondents. This step can be informed through desk research, consultations, workshops, whatever works best for you. And so once you have identified the measure that you're going to study and to focus on, you have to define the different attributes and the different levels. Then again, this is really the key step, as you have to ensure that the attributes are policy relevant and that they actually have an impact on farmers' decisions to enroll or not. So there is some sort of balance to be found as to include enough attributes to reflect all the trade-offs that farmers make, but also not too many attributes so that the task doesn't become too confusing or overwhelming to respondents. And so choosing the levels is also key. You must make sure that these levels are range wide enough to reveal the preferences, but they must remain realistic in a real-world setting. So at this step, it's really important to include experts' inputs, which can be done through literature review, but also what's usually recommended is to organize interviews or focus groups and to really make sure that you capture what really matters in farmers' decisions. So once you have defined all the attributes and the different levels that they take, the next step will be to combine them into different policy scenarios, so the scenarios that will be presented to the farmers. And so this leads to the construction of the experimental design. So the goal here is to build choice sets that will allow to estimate the preferences as accurately as possible, then again, without overwhelming or confusing the respondents. So we usually at this stage rely on statistical design methods to select a limited but coherent and optimized subsets of possible combinations of levels that will allow to maximize the variation and the independence between the attributes across the different scenarios. So at this stage, we usually use specific software. So I put two examples, which are Engine and JMP. The two examples that I put here are they require a license, but I know that you can also use several software such as RStudio, for instance, that are actually free. And so it's also at this stage that we will decide how many choice sets each respondent will be getting will have to answer to, and how many alternatives there will be per set, whether to include or not a status quo option. So once you have your experimental design done, it's time to translate it into a questionnaire that will be engaging for the stakeholders, as the task can be a little bit complicated for respondents. So it includes the discrete choice experiment section, but there's also more descriptive part to make sure that everything is clear and understandable and that farmers understand what is expected of them. And additional question to get more socio-demographic elements that will be used in the analysis stage. And so once the survey is done, it's usually required to pre-test the questionnaire, pre-test the experimental design on a small sample of farmers to make sure that the attributes and the level that you chose are clear, that they're relevant, and to make sure that the task is not too overwhelming, that it's manageable for farmers. And once, well, depending on the results of that pre-test, we usually adjust the experimental design. We make a few changes in the questionnaire to get a finalized version. And so now the first step of really building the discrete choice experiment is done. So we go into the data collection phase. So you roll it out on the target population. You actually have to discrete trace experiment requires quite an important sample of farmers to collect sufficient data for the analysis to be well, qualitative and coherent. This stage can be done either through an online survey or through face-to-face interviews, depending on the context of the study and what means time you have. And so, yeah, the goal is to collect enough high-quality data from that representative sample, so to make sure that you will get a meaningful analysis later on. And so once the data is collected, we can use several statistical models that are all based on the random utility theory to conduct the analysis, so that these are mixed logic models. I'm not going to get too much in the detail of this. But yeah, so they estimate how each attribute influences the choices made by farmers, and it gives insight into the trade-offs that they make or that they are willing to make, how much they value different policy features. And so once, and this step requires economic skills and to use then again specific software. So for instance, RStudio, as I mentioned, that doesn't require a license, but you can also use data, for instance. Once you have your results, it's time to report and communicate. So it's a key step as well to disseminate your findings to several stakeholders that want to disseminate with. The goal here is to make the results as clear and understandable as possible, to really highlight the findings and to put them in relation with the policy implications that they have. Now, if we look more at the practical application of discrete trace experiments, it can be used more in an ex-ante setting before implementing the new measures during the design phase during the design phase of the intervention. Can also be used during implementation if you want to adjust certain schemes. So that is actually what we have been doing in the case study in France. So we are working with the Occitanie region that proposes to farmers one agro-environmental and climatic measure that's called a transition of practices, and that's on protein autonomy in the livestock sector. And so that particular measure does not have the uptake that was expected, and so the region wanted to understand why and what can be changed in the measure to enhance that uptake. And so we have been conducting the discrete trace experiments. I put there on the right an example of one of the choice sets that we designed. It's not a finalized version here. I can see that the writing is actually quite heavy, so we would have to make it more appealing to farmers to answer, maybe add some visual aids or images to make it more appealing. As you can see, we have these three different attributes here. We couldn't add a monetary attribute, so the level of support, the payment that farmers will receive. So that's actually quite an important limitation in the case of discrete trace experiments, since it doesn't allow us to really quantify the willingness to pay of farmers and to quantify the trade-offs. And so in the absence of that particular attribute, we chose to actually use another method that is called the theory of cleansed behavior. So it's conceptually different from discrete trace experiments, but they have some common goals. And in particular, it can help to understand the determinants of behaviors for farmers. And so if I go into now the challenges of the discrete trace experiment and give you some practical tips as well. I identified 4 main limitations. The first one is the complexity of the experimental design, as it requires important technical skills to generate an efficient design. So it is recommended either to work with a discrete trace experiment expert or to train the staff that will be responsible for the experiments, to use the dedicated softwares, and at the end of the first phase of building the discrete trace experiments, to pilot test the design, to conduct preliminary interviews and focus groups. The second limitation is the participants' understanding and the response quality. Discrete trace experiment can be a complex task for respondents, and so the comprehension of what is expected of them, or the measure of whatever can be reduced, which can lead to low quality responses that will then impact your analysis. So it's really required to limit the number of choice sets, to use clear language, visual aids, and to pretest with the target audience. Discrete trace experiment is also resource intensive. In particular, it's a long process. A full cycle can take from 6 to 12 months. Then again, requires a certain level of skills. So it's recommended to integrate it early in the policy planning phase, then again to work with an expert. And finally, a discrete trace experiment relies on stated preferences and not on actual behaviors, since choices are made in an hypothetical setting. And so it does not always reflect real-world decisions. So to balance the impact that this could have on your results and on the analysis, it's usually recommended to include a no-choice option, that's the status quo option that I mentioned earlier, or to add questions to ask respondents the great certainty of their choices. And so here I put some additional useful resources that you can check out if you are interested in learning more about discrete trace experiments. Thank you.